Welcome, everyone. We're so happy that you could join us this evening. My name is Karen Tylick. I'm the program manager with Homegrown. And we're very happy to have with us today Greg Nielsen of Nielsen Training and Consulting, a partner of Civitas Strategies, who's going to walk us through the Paycheck Protection Program forgiveness process for loans under $150,000. So we're very fortunate to have his expertise this evening. We'd love to know a bit about who is with us today. So if you would please take a moment to say hello in the chat, introduce yourself. Who do we have with us? What program are you with? And then where you're located. We'd love to know a bit more about you. Wanted to mention that today's session is being recorded so that we can share it with folks afterwards. Your mics and cameras are automatically off at the moment, although we will have some Q&A at the end, and you'll be able to raise your hand at that time. If you'd like to vocalize your question, turn on your mic and ask your question. You're also welcome to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to ask questions throughout the session, and we'll be sure to address them either as we go or at the end. So again, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm going to turn things over to Greg.
Excellent. Thank you, Karen. It's great to be with you. My name is Greg Nielsen. I'm from Nielsen Training and Consulting, a partner of Civitas Strategies. And today we're going to be talking about the Paycheck Protection forgiveness process. So for many of you, and I assume if you're on this webinar tonight, it's because you obtained a PPP loan at some point in the past, maybe PPP 1 and PPP 2, and you're getting ready to apply for forgiveness, or you're thinking about what does that forgiveness process look like. What we want to do tonight is give you helpful information, number one, and then number two, address any questions that you may have about the PPP forgiveness process, about information you may need, forms you may need, documentation that you'll want to gather in advance. So a couple of things that we're going to cover today, and I encourage you, as Karen mentioned, if you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A feature. Karen's going to be monitoring that for us. And if we have a question to be addressed on a certain slide, we'll pause and take our time to do that. I'm also going to make sure that we leave time to address questions at the end. So if you're more comfortable vocalizing your question at the end, we'll use a process to do that at the very end. So I want to make sure that everybody's comfortable that we will get to your question tonight. What we want to cover is, what is the forgiveness process? So what does that process step by step look like? How do you position yourself and your business for success at each one of those steps? Number two, which form should you use? I get this question all the time from folks. There are several forms that are different options for the Paycheck Protection Program forgiveness process. We're going to make sure that you know exactly what form is most applicable for your situation. Number three, how do you fill it out? Number four, if you still have questions after the webinar, how can you go about getting help? We want to make sure before we wrap up tonight that everyone has access to the resources they need to be successful in the forgiveness process. So let's start at the very beginning with, why is the forgiveness process important? Why are you taking your time on a Tuesday evening or Tuesday afternoon to talk about the PPP forgiveness process? Number one, and most importantly, it converts the loan, the PPP loan, to a grant. Meaning, if you are successful in applying for forgiveness, it removes the debt, you get to keep the funds and don't have to repay any part or all of those funds. So why is forgiveness important? It's important because it takes debt off your books and it turns it into a grant. Whatever remains does become debt for your business. So for example, let's say that my original PPP loan was for $5,000. I apply for forgiveness, and through the bank, the SBA, Small Business Administration, says only $4,500 of that is going to be forgiven. What happens to that remaining $500? That remaining $500 becomes debt that has to get paid back according to a schedule that we'll talk about. The good news for you is that the most recent rules changes, and if you followed the PPP from the beginning back in 2019, 2020, you'll know that there have been a lot of rules changes. The most recent rules changes make it significantly easier for you, particularly home-based providers, to achieve 100% forgiveness. And I hope by the end of tonight's webinar, you have all the tools and resources you need to maximize your forgiveness. It's important to realize when we think about PPP forgiveness that, as we talked about when you applied, Only specific expenses are allowed. So when you received your PPP funds, you were told that only certain expenses are allowed to be used with PPP funds. Those expenses include payroll, and if you normally deduct them, items like rent, utilities, mortgage interest, operations costs, property damage, supplier costs, worker protection. At least 60% of your forgiveness amount needs to be spent on payroll. So back to our example, if I received a $10,000 PPP loan, I have to show that at least 6,000 of that amount was used on payroll related costs in order to achieve full forgiveness of my loan. W-2 rehiring, employee rehiring is important. So if you have W-2 employees, we'll talk about why that matters and how to make sure that you don't get dinged, that you don't get penalized there when it comes to W-2 employee rehiring. And then finally, it's important to have records that show the expenses that you incurred using PPP funds. Let's talk a little bit about the forgiveness process overview, step by step. The first day, so if you want to think of it as day one is the day you received the PPP funds in your account or the following pay period start day. So you can choose, you can elect what is going to be your start date for PPP forgiveness purposes. And your two choices are choice number one is the day the money hit your account. So if the money hit my account on March 1st, I can elect March 1st as my start date, right? My other option is, let's say those funds hit my account on a Wednesday, which was right smack in the middle of a pay period for me. I don't have to consider that Wednesday as day one. If it's easier for my accounting purposes, I can consider day one the first day of the following pay period, right? So if the next pay period is on the following Monday, I can consider that as day one for my PPP calculation purposes. What happens next is you have anywhere between 8 and 24 weeks to use those PPP funds. Again, items like payroll have to be 60% of how you use those PPP funds. You can use up to 40% in rent, utilities, mortgage interest, and other eligible expenses. So again, you have anywhere from 8 to 24 weeks to use those PPP funds. So a lot of times, if you remember at the beginning of the PPP process, everyone was rushing, thinking we only had 8 to 10 weeks in order to use those funds. The recent guidance, the most recent law that was passed, extended that period of time. So you have up to 24 weeks from your start date in order to use those PPP funds. Once you have expended those PPP funds, you are then eligible to apply for forgiveness. Forgiveness is an application that happens through your bank, and you have up to 10 months from the expiration of your PPP covered period, right? So let's take our example. Let's say I got my $10,000 PPP loan on March 1st. I choose March 1st as my first day of the covered period. I have up to 24 weeks from March 1st to use my PPP loan. I then have an additional 10 months after that in order to apply for forgiveness. The forgiveness application is going to be very similar to the PPP application in that it is going to go through your bank. Your bank will typically send a link or some other form to apply for forgiveness. Most banks have adopted an electronic process to handle those forgiveness applications. And you have 10 months again from the expiration of your covered period in order to apply through your bank. I'm going to pause here before I get to that last bullet point on the slide and just talk a little bit about the forgiveness application. One of the most common questions I get, and I know several of you may have it as well, is how do I get this forgiveness application from my bank? Am I responsible for reaching out to the bank? Is someone from the bank going to contact me? What do I have to do and when? The short answer is there is not one black and white answer. Just like when we think about the PPP application, how every bank handled the application process a little bit differently, every bank handles the forgiveness process a little bit differently. Some banks are really proactive and they will reach out to their customers and say, we've noticed that you are now 24 weeks after we issued the PPP loan. You're eligible to apply for forgiveness, and here's the link to do so. That's what some banks have done that are proactive. Other banks have been silent and have waited for their customers to contact them. Some banks have been a mixture of the two. If the loan is above a certain amount, they reach out to their customers. If the PPP loan is below that amount, they don't. My recommendation to all providers, certainly everyone on the call today, is initiate a proactive conversation with your bank during the time of your PPP loan, certainly during the 10-month period that you have to apply for forgiveness, and say, look, I applied for and received a PPP loan that was administered through your bank. Here is my PPP loan number. I'm interested in applying for forgiveness, and I'd like guidance from you on how to do that through the bank. I think proactive is the way to go. I think proactive saves you a lot of time and effort and worry of, is the bank going to reach out to me? My recommendation is to be proactive and to have those conversations early with your bank. Finally, once you've applied for forgiveness, you've applied through your bank, the bank transmits that forgiveness application to the Small Business Administration. The SBA renders a decision and lets you know, typically within 90 days of your forgiveness application, anything that remains a balance. So again, if let's say you have a $5,000 PPP loan and $4,500 is forgiven, let's say you have a balance of $500, that becomes a loan at 1% interest that must be paid back within a 5-year period, right? So again, there's this, I believe, a 6-month grace period where you can make payments towards that interest free. However, the balance does become a loan at 1% interest rate. A note on applying for forgiveness. So we've established a 4-step process that we're going to walk through tonight that helps put you in the best position possible. Step 1 is gather your records. I always tell people, before you apply for forgiveness, make sure you have everything that you're going to need for the electronic application at your disposal and in your file. It'll make it a lot easier for you. You won't have to log in and log out repeatedly as you gather different paperwork. We'll talk about what records you should have in front of you, but step 1 is always make sure you have your file there with you with all the documentation that you're going to need. Step 2 is you're going to select the proper form to use. There are 3 different options. There's the Form 3508S, the Form 3508EZ, and what the SBA calls the full Form 3508. We'll talk about the differences between each of those forms and which one is applicable for most individuals, most providers. Step 3 is you'll fill out the form. And then step 4 is the form goes to your bank and the SBA reviews and typically renders a determination. As I've said, it's not a hard and fast rule, but typically what I've seen with organizations is typically you'll receive a decision from the SBA within 90, certainly within 90 to 120 days after filing that form for forgiveness. Couple of key points at the outset. If at all possible, on your PPP forgiveness application, use the PPP for payroll, if at all possible. It's less paperwork, it's less documentation, it's less complicated for the bank and the SBA to review. So for example, if you got that $10,000 PPP loan and you're able to show that you used all $10,000 for payroll, that's a very simple calculation. It's very simple documentation for the bank to review. Second, almost everyone is going to be able to use the 3508S or the 3508EZ form. We'll talk about, as I said, the differences between them, but just about everybody that I've encountered has been able to use the simplified 3508S form or the simple 3508EZ form. If you're a sole proprietor, your owner operator pay is taken from your 2019-2020 taxes. So if you are the only employee of the business, if you are a home-based provider, you don't have any W-2 employees, you are the owner, you are the operator of the business, the payroll, when we talk about payroll, the pay is taken from your 2019 or 2020 taxes, and it is under the same formula that you used when applying for the PPP. So the same way you calculated your PPP loan amount will be the same way you calculate your PPP forgiveness amount, your owner operator pay. You're going to apply through the bank that issued your loan. So if I went through Bank of America or I went through Chase or I went through Wells Fargo or a community bank for my PPP loan, that's who's going to be responsible for my forgiveness process. And then finally, a note, because this question has come up a number of times, forgiveness is never larger than the loan amount. So let's say my PPP loan was for $10,000. During that covered period, I had payroll of $15,000. The maximum amount of forgiveness is going to be limited to the amount of the loan, which is the $10,000. Step one, as I said, is make sure you gather your records. So a note on allowable expenses. When we talk about payroll as an allowable expense, make sure you're thinking of payroll broadly. Under the terms of the PPP, you can consider, for payroll purposes, wages and salary for you or any W-2 employees that you have. State payroll taxes count as payroll expenses. Paid time off. Healthcare, if your business offers a group healthcare plan, healthcare premiums that are paid by the business can be counted as payroll expenses, as well as group retirement benefits. So if your business provides a group retirement plan for you or your employees, the premiums that you as an employer pay into that plan count as payroll expenses for purposes of the PPP and also for purposes of meeting that 60% threshold. Non-payroll allowable expenses. This is limited to if you ordinarily and already deduct these expenses. Items like rent, utilities, mortgage interest, operating costs, property damage, supplier costs, worker protection. And again, this can be a maximum of 40% of the total. If you're using non-payroll expenses and even your payroll expenses, they should be similar to the same time period in 2019. So again, you don't want to trigger any red flags for the SBA. You don't want to trigger any audit red flags. So it's important to consider, are those expenses that you're claiming during the PPP time period similar to the level of expenses that you had during the same time period in 2019? A note on non-allowable expenses. If you have 1099 contractors or cash-only employees, you cannot include any payments made to them in your PPP forgiveness calculations. They were not eligible to be paid with PPP funds. Mortgage principal, the principal that you pay on your mortgage, is not an allowable PPP expense. Credit card debt. So we've had some providers think, well, if the PPP turns into a loan at 1% interest rate and my credit card is at a significantly higher interest rate, can I simply use my PPP funds to pay down my credit card debt, refinance my credit card debt, and then simply pay back the PPP at 1%? The answer is no. You can't use PPP funds to pay down or refinance existing credit card debt. And then finally, non-allowable expenses, rent, utilities, and mortgage, if they are not typical business deductions for you. When we think about records, so what type of records should you keep? If you are self-employed, meaning you don't have any employees, you're the owner, it's important to keep bank statements as well as canceled checks. So if I use the PPP, and so for example, in my business, I am the only employee. I used my PPP loan to pay myself as a sole proprietor, to pay myself as the owner of the business. The records that I need to keep in order to achieve PPP forgiveness are my bank statements, number one, showing that I did in fact pay myself, that that money was withdrawn from my business account, as well as the canceled checks. So the statement, the canceled check showing that that check was deposited by me, right? So as an owner, those are the types of records I need to keep. If you have W-2 employees and you use PPP funds to pay your W-2 employees, you'll want to keep, just like same way, your bank statements, third-party payroll reports. So if I go through ADP, if ADP does my payroll or Paychecks or some other third-party payroll provider, they will be able to provide and generate for you a PPP forgiveness report that demonstrates your payroll expenses. And then finally, if I have W-2 employees, I'll want to keep in my PPP records my payroll tax filings, which is your IRS Form 941, as well as your state payroll tax filings. If I've used PPP funds to pay benefits, so as we said, eligible expenses include group healthcare and group retirement plans. If I use PPP funds to pay either of those, you want to keep your payment receipts showing that you've paid that, canceled checks, as well as your account statement from those companies. So if my health insurance is through Blue Cross Blue Shield, I'll want to keep my account statement that reflects that I paid my group healthcare premium for that particular month or those particular months. If you've used it for non-payroll expenses, so if I'm counting my rent and lease payments towards my PPP forgiveness application, you'll want to keep a copy of the lease, which demonstrates what that monthly lease payment is, and then a copy of receipts or canceled checks, again showing the date and showing that you did in fact make those rent payments. Utilities, you'll want to keep the invoices for those months during your PPP period, as well as the receipts or canceled checks. Mortgage interest, what you'll want to have in your records is your lender amortization schedule, which shows your interest payment amounts. And then again, receipts or canceled checks showing that you made those mortgage payments. Operations costs, property damage, supplier costs, things like that. You'll want to have access to your receipts as well as any invoices that you used for payment. Those are more external records. So those are the types of documents that you may need to upload when it comes time to your PPP forgiveness application, or that you may be asked for if you're audited down the road. A couple of internal records that you'll want to keep in the file as well. You're not likely to be asked to provide these. The bank is not going to ask for them. But in the event that you are ever audited down the road, you'll want to have these in your file. Number one, a certification that salaries were not reduced by more than 25%, showing people's prior salary arrangements. Right? So one of the things you'll want to have if you have W-2 employees is, even if it's a short memorandum or a payroll report, that certifies that salaries were not reduced by more than 25%. A lot of providers that I've worked with had employees that refused to come back to work for various reasons. They weren't comfortable with COVID. They were making more money elsewhere. They didn't want to come back. If you extended offers to employees to come back and they refused, it's important to have a notation about that in your records. Again, even if it's a simple memorandum for your own records, that on February 22nd, I extended a job offer to Jane Doe to come back to work in our business. On March 1st, Jane Doe communicated to me that she refused that offer and didn't want to come back. That's important to keep in your records, because you're not penalized for employees who refuse to come back after you've extended a job offer to them. Third internal record you want to have is a record of your employee levels and hours throughout the PPP period. So again, if my PPP period was January 1st through March 10th, what I'll want to have in my record is a record of my employee levels and hours during that period. I had 5 employees in week 1. I had 4 employees in week 2. What was the fluctuation, if any, during your covered period? You also want to have all of your PPP application documents, just in case you need to refer back to those, as well as a copy of your 2019 and 2020 business tax return. Again, these are just internal records. You're not likely to be asked to produce these, but it will make it a lot easier to apply for forgiveness, and a lot easier if you are ever audited to have all the documents in one place. Step 2, so after we've gathered all of our records, step 2 is to identify what in the world is the right form for me to use. There are 3 different options. How do I know which one is the right one to use? 3508S, 3508EZ, or 3508. Let's talk about it really quickly, because there's a very simple way to determine which form is right for you. If you have a loan of less than $150,000, you are automatically eligible to use Form 3508S. The good news about Form 3508S, it is by far the simplest of the 3 forms. Most providers can fill out and complete the 3508S form in certainly under 30 minutes, most providers under 15 minutes. That's the good news. So if your loan was less than $150,000, you can use the Form 3508S. Form 3508EZ is for almost every other provider over $150,000. If your business was impacted by a government order, so that if a government order required you to close for a period of time, or if a government order required you to reduce your capacity for a period of time. You can see how just about every childcare provider, home-based provider, was impacted by this, whether it was a CDC order, whether it was a health department order, some government order that required you to close or significantly reduce your capacity, and your loan was over $150,000, you can use the Form 3508EZ, which is just a little bit longer than the 3508S, but still fairly simple for most providers to complete. Finally, Form 3508S is the longest form. It is the most complicated of the three. We're not going to go into it in our session tonight just because the fraction, the percentage of providers that have to fill out the full Form 3508 is minuscule. It's only if you reduced the rate of pay of your W-2 employees by more than 25% and your business was not impacted by a government order. Right? So if by some chance your business was not at all impacted by COVID, not at all impacted by a government order that reduced your capacity, reduced your ability to operate your business, and you reduced your W-2 employees' pay rate by more than 25%, only under those conditions would you have to fill out Form 3508. I would say the vast majority of providers that I've worked with, certainly in the home-based space, are able to use 3508S. Those few that are not able to use the S form, almost all of them fall into the 3508EZ category. We'll talk briefly about the 3508S form. It provides an extremely simple process for PPP loan forgiveness. Rest easy if you are someone like me who does not like to do math. I am not good at math. I don't like to do math. On the 3508S form, there are no calculations. You are not going to be doing any math. You're not going to be adding any numbers. It has greatly reduced paperwork. And again, it's available from the bank that issued your loan. Most banks will use an electronic portal of some sort that inputs the information from that 3508S form. Who can use the 3508S? As we said a minute ago, if your PPP is less than $150,000, you can use the 3508S. It doesn't matter if you're a contractor, if you're a sole proprietor, if you're a nonprofit, if you're a for-profit corporation, if your PPP is less than $150,000, you can use the 3508S form. If your PPP is more than $150,000, you can likely still use the EZ form, as we said, impacted by a government order. You can see our guide that's available at the website down below, and I know Karen is planning to share those resources both at the end of the webinar and subsequent to the webinar. We have a user guide that walks you step by step through everything that we're covering tonight. That's the website there. Don't worry about writing down that long web address. Now we'll make sure that you get it at the end of the webinar and also after the webinar tonight. When it comes to filling out the 3508S, I promised you that it was fairly simple. Part 1 is going to ask for basic information on you and your PPP loan, right? So it's going to ask you basic demographics about you, your business, your address, information about your business, and then information about your PPP loan. Remember when I said it's important to gather your records and have your PPP application handy? One of the pieces of information it may ask you is to write out what was your PPP loan number, what was your SBA PPP number. All of that is found on your PPP approval documents, right? So if it's not pre-populated for you by your individual bank, that's where you can find that information. So step 1 in 3508S is very simple, basic information about you, your address, contact information, and your PPP loan. Step 2 is a series of boxes that you will initial that we call representations and certifications. All you are doing in this section is it's a series of statements that you are initialing that certify that the money you received from the PPP was used in accordance with the program. You're not proving it. You're not uploading documents. You are simply making a good faith representation and certification that you're signing to that the money was used in accordance with your application and in accordance with the terms of the program. A reminder that our user guide, our user handbook has details on each individual field. So if you have questions about what number is it asking me for here, or what information do I put in this field, or what is this asking me about, consult the user guide because it goes through field by field for the 3508S form. So a quick example to use. Jane Smith is a home-based child care provider in Passaic, New Jersey. On her 2019 Schedule C, line 31, on her taxes, she made $36,400. Therefore, her PPP loan was originally for 10 weeks of that pay. Her PPP loan was $7,000. She's a sole proprietor. She's the only employee of the business. Her PPP loan landed in the bank on May 15th, 2020. Jane put that amount of the loan, $7,000, and matched that number for the forgiveness amount. She initialed the representations and certifications and is now ready to go to her bank's online site to submit that information. This is what the 3508S form looks like. Here's just a screenshot. You see at the very top exactly what we were talking about. Basic information, business legal name, business address, tax ID number, contact name, business phone number, email address, NAICS code. You can find that on your PPP loan documents. Then down below, information about your PPP loan. This is where you'll specify, are you applying for forgiveness for your first draw PPP loan or your second draw PPP loan? You'll enter the SBA loan number, the PPP loan amount, the lender PPP loan number, which is different than the SBA number, the disbursement date, the date that the funds hit your account, number of employees, and then down below is where you will specify the covered period. Again, anywhere from 8 to 24 weeks. And then the next screen that you see here is an example of the representations and certifications. So the authorized representative of the borrower certifies all of the following by initialing next to each one. Borrower has complied with the requirements. Eligible uses. The amount proceeds are used for payroll cost. Information provided in the application true and correct in all material aspects. Signature and date. So again, you can see the form itself is very straightforward. It was designed to be easy to fill out. A couple of final thoughts, and then we'll open it up to questions. I see there are a couple of questions that have popped up in the chat, and I'm looking forward to addressing any questions that you have. Number one, you can get through the process. Sometimes we think of the forgiveness process and it seems really daunting. There was a lot of confusion for a lot of people, myself included, as we went through the PPP application process, that process of applying for and receiving funds. Same thing, as guidance changed and evolved with the forgiveness process, you can get through this process. It has been streamlined. Follow Homegrown for any news updates. Homegrown has done a phenomenal job of keeping providers up to date throughout the process of changing guidance, where to go for up-to-date resources and help. And then third, help is available. If you do need additional help, you can email our team at ppp@civstrat.com. I'll repeat that again in case anyone is just on a phone line or on a landline. ppp@civstrat, C-I-V as in Victor, strat.com. There is also a website to go to, homegrownchildcare.org/PPP-resources. That will have access to additional information beyond what we've covered in the webinar tonight. With that, I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share. And Karen, can I bring you back into the discussion here for any questions that may have come up that we want to make sure we address tonight?
Yes, thanks so much, Greg. So much helpful information. So we did have a question earlier on that I believe you addressed, but it'd be great to have
Mhm.
confirmation of that. So someone wanted to know, we could use 100% of the loan on payroll, correct?
That is absolutely correct. And that's my recommendation if you're able to do it. So if you are able to reach your PPP loan amount using just payroll, that makes the documentation a lot easier. Then you're not having to gather items like rent receipts and mortgage receipts and utilities invoices and things like that. So if you're able to meet it with payroll alone, for most people, payroll is their largest expense. It's certainly best practice to do that.
Great, thank you so much. And then we have a hand raised by Sabrina. So Sabrina, I'm
Yes.
going to go ahead and allow you to talk. So we'll just need to turn on your microphone and then you can ask your question.
Okay. Um, he answered the question. It was for payroll. I'm a family licensed child care provider, so he did answer my question. Thank you.
Excellent.
Perfect.
That's great. Thank you, Sabrina.
No
Great.
worries.
Thank you. Looks like we have another hand. So I apologize. I believe this is Fuzia. I'm going to allow you to talk. So please unmute yourself and you can ask your question.
Hi, Karen. First of all, I just want to say thank you to you guys for educating us on that. And I know Sabrina did ask, but I just want to clarify, like about on our C form, like we put, like I made, suppose, like, 37,000 last year. So I divide 37,000 into like 3 months and pay myself, or how do I pay myself to make it even? Like suppose if I received a PPP of like $8,000, and how do I pay it to myself? How do I make sure that I'm paying 8,000 to myself, and how I divide that into month to clarify if I get audit?
Correct. So great. That's a great question. It's important to think about paying yourself according to what was on your Schedule C, not according to what your PPP loan was, right? So let's say in your example, on your Schedule C, you said you made $36,000, right? So what you would do is you would divide $36,000 by 12 months in the year. That would be your monthly payroll, right? So
Right.
each month you would write yourself a check in that amount, or you could do it in 2-week intervals, however you want to pay yourself. So if you want to pay yourself twice a month or once a month, however you want to do that. But your payroll to yourself would be that $36,000 divided by 12. And then because you can use the PPP over a 24-week period, you would have more than enough from your PPP application to count towards payroll. Does that answer your question?
Uh, One more question. Like, usually since we are sole propriety, we usually don't write a check to ourselves.
Mhm.
And usually, I go to the bank, take out the money and use it, whatever I need to do. I don't know how I'm going to clear that if I go, I get audit. I don't know, how we never did all this. Basically, we were not, or maybe I'm not raised that professionally. I was like, okay, if I'm paying myself, I know I can write it down
Mhm.
on my monthly stuff, but
Mhm.
I didn't know I have to give a check to myself before all this crazy stuff happens.
No, you're absolutely right, and that happens all the time. So particularly for folks like it sounds like you and me, those of us who don't have employees, we pay ourselves on different schedules, right?
Exactly.
It's a best practice moving forward to actually physically write yourself a check each month. That does make the paper trail a little bit easier. The good news is for you, particularly if your PPP loan amount was, as it sounds like, under $150,000, you're going to be filling out that 3508S form. So you're not going to have to show any documentation that you wrote yourself a check or that you transferred a certain number of funds. You're going to be making those representations that you use the funds for appropriate purposes, which it sounds like you did. But I would say
But just
moving forward, it's a best
moving forward,
practice.
right? That, but in case if I get like my first PPP, I didn't know all that stuff. Like I said,
Mhm.
I didn't even apply for PPP because I didn't
Yes,
know that daycare people are eligible
right,
until March.
right.
It was so many loopholes in the news and stuff like that. So I guess you did
So
answer, but just in case if I get audit, what is my option?
So you would be able to show the bank transfers. You said you make
That's fair
make
enough. Mhm.
transfers. You can show bank transfers from your business account to your personal account. That could count
Okay.
as owner payroll. You could
Okay.
also choose to then use any invoices that you may still have from utilities or rent or other covered expenses to meet that PPP amount as well.
Yeah, that of course that's on record, not a
Yes,
problem. Yes.
exactly.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I appreciate
No
it.
problem.
Thank
No
you.
problem.
Great. One follow-up question to that, and then we'll take Bendu's question. Monica says, I was told that you did not have to break it down into monthly payments. So for example, I paid myself in 3 installments. Was that a mistake?
No, not a mistake at all. So there's no requirement that you pay yourself monthly. That's why I said providers can pay themselves on whatever schedule works best for them. Some providers write a weekly check to themselves. Some providers do it once a month. Some providers do it once every 3 months. There just has to be some sort of documentation within the PPP covered period that those funds were spent that way.
Great. You're welcome, Monica. Okay, so Bendu, we see that your hand is raised, so you should now be able to unmute your mic and ask your question.
Hi.
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 Yeah, I just want to thank him so much for making a complicated topic so easy to understand. And another question I had was, let we assume that you don't use the entire PPP. What is the percentage rate for the one that you don't use to pay back? What is the rate?
1%.
Thank you.
And I believe it's a 5-year payback period. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe there's a 6-month grace period. So if, for example, you didn't use all your PPP funds, or you don't achieve 100% forgiveness, within the first 6 months, I believe you can pay it back interest-free.
Okay, thank you very much.
No problem. My pleasure.
Thank you for your question. We have a question from Gwen. If I use all of the amount of the loan before 24 weeks, can I apply for forgiveness early?
Absolutely. Yes. What you want to make sure is that you don't apply before 10 weeks, because that was the original period of the loan. But if you have used the funds by week 18 or week 19 and you want to go ahead and apply for forgiveness early, assuming your bank is open to receiving that forgiveness application, you certainly can do that.
Great. Okay, looks like we have another question from Monica. Monica, you should be able to unmute.
Unmute. Okay. Can you hear me now?
I can.
Hear you.
Okay. Hi. I just have a question for you guys. So on the application for the paycheck, for the borrower application, I have an average monthly payment of $8,000. Okay, and I pay myself weekly. So to my understanding, for what you say, that's right, correct?
That's fine. Yes, if that's how you pay yourself, typically
Yes.
that's fine.
That's fine. Okay. Okay. I just want to make sure that I did the right thing.
No, you
okay.
are.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. And we have a question from Michelle in the chat. Does the revenue have to be different in 2019 than in 2020?
Great question. So this is one where we want to draw a distinction. There is PPP1 and then there is PPP2. So PPP1 was back right when the pandemic was first beginning. Right. So that was the first time they created the PPP program. There was no revenue reduction. You didn't have to show any revenue reduction in order to receive the PPP. The second PPP, so if you received that first one and then went back and applied for a second PPP loan, in order to qualify for that, you had to have a reduction in revenue of 25% when either looking at the whole year, 2020 versus 2019, or 1 quarter of 2020 when compared to the same quarter in 2019. That's something that you didn't have to prove when you applied for PPP2, but you may have to show it when you apply for forgiveness. So again, important to distinguish between PPP1 and PPP2. PPP2 does have the revenue test. PPP1 did not have a revenue test.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. Looks like that is all of our questions at the moment, but I want to leave
Awesome.
space in case we have any additional. Please feel free to raise your hand or to ask those in the chat. I'm going to drop the link to the handbook one more time. So a lot of this great information that Greg has shared, it can also be found in the handbook, especially information on the forms, walking you through how to fill out the forms, which form should you use, as well as examples of what that looks like once you've completed that form. So super helpful information there. And then I also wanted to note that it is available in Spanish as well on our website, and that we will be holding a a similar information session in Spanish on Thursday. So if you have any colleagues who are Spanish speaking, please share that with them. We would love to have them join us on Thursday. And now it looks like we do have a question from Carolyn. So Carolyn, please go ahead and unmute your mic and ask your question.
So you're saying that I had the PPP 2, the second one, because I didn't do one in 20. So I did one in 21. So I have to use the S.
No, that it's important to distinguish, Carolyn. You said you
Okay.
did not receive the PPP in 2020. How many
Right.
how many different
One.
PPP loans have you
I've gotten
received?
one.
Oh, okay.
I received one.
Okay. So you are
And that was
not
in 21.
correct.
That was this
So if
year.
you correct. So that was your PPP 1. So you do not
Okay.
have to worry about the revenue test, number 1. And assuming your loan was for less than $150,000, you'll
Right, 'cause it was
use the
10.
form 3508S.
3508, yes. Okay. And then I have to use my 2019 tax return?
In filling out the form, or I'm for
Well,
what purpose?
For the calculations, they use my
Correct.
2020.
You will use the same calculations that you used in the PPP application. So if you
Okay.
used your 2020 tax return to apply for the PPP in 2021, you'll use that same tax return that to make sure your calculations are accurate.
Okay, okay. Yes, I got it now. Yes, I did do the calculation work from the 2020.
Yes,
Okay, okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn.
you're welcome.
Looks like Cheryl has a question.
Uh-huh.
So Cheryl, please go ahead and unmute.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great, Cheryl. How are you?
Good. I did both 1 and 2, and I just want you to explain again the revenue test piece.
So in order to qualify for PPP2, you had to demonstrate, or you had to certify when you applied for it, that your revenue was reduced by 25% or more from 2020 to 2019. And you could look at that one of two ways. You could look at it as my annual revenue for all of 2020 was 25% or more less than my total revenue for 2019. Or you could look at it by quarter and say, oh boy, second quarter of 2020 compared to the second quarter of 2019, boy, I meet the 25% or more threshold that way.
Okay. Okay.
And that's how you gained access. That's how you gain eligibility for PPP2.
Okay. So I'm able to use the 3508S form when I apply for forgiveness.
Correct. The 3508S form has nothing to do with whether you used, whether you're subject to the revenue reduction or not.
Okay.
3508S is only about the size of the loan. So if your loan was 150,000 or more, you can use the S form.
Okay. So I've already done the revenue test pretty much.
Correct.
Yeah. In order to receive it, I've already done that.
Some banks will ask you to demonstrate it before you fill out the 3508S form. But again, that's up to the individual bank.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Such good questions tonight, Karen. You got a great attendee list here.
They're a sharp bunch, and
They
we
are.
appreciate all of your guidance because there are so many ways to ask these questions and to apply them to different situations. I'm going to share one that's in our Q&A. So it says, if you received both PPP loans and together they are under 150,000, which form do you use? Is it the 3508S?
Correct. You would still be able to use the 3508S form. The loans are not combined. They're not aggregated. So the loans are looked at separately. If your first PPP loan was under $150,000, you use the 3508S for that. If your second one was under $150,000, you still can use the 3508S for that.
Okay. Great. And we do have one question about applying for the loan. So I never applied for a PPP loan during the beginning. if I apply now, will that be my PPP first loan? If I apply, what tax return am I using? Greg, can you speak to the current status? of
Sure,
PPP?
Karen, this one's going to break my heart just a little bit, but unfortunately the PPP is no longer open. They've stopped accepting applications. They've run out of funding in the program, and there hasn't been a whole lot of chatter or discussion about renewing it. So at this time, there is no application that is open for a PPP loan.
Yeah, very sorry to share that information. We may have one more question. It looks like Michelle, I'm not certain if your question has already been answered. I'll go ahead and give you the ability to unmute, and you can let us know if you still have a question.
The question was answered. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle.
That's good.
Okay, great. Well, I don't see any other hands, and I don't see any other questions in the chat, so we can just give it one more minute in case we have any further questions. We also do want to share that email address, ppp@civstrat.com. You can continue to ask your questions there. So Greg and Gary Romano and his team are available to continue to support you with this process. And they are such an amazing resource to us. So since I don't see any additional questions at this time, we'll go ahead and thank Greg for sharing his wealth of knowledge and his expertise with us. So very helpful. And I want to thank all of our providers who are on the call for taking the time today to join us. And of course, for the amazing work that you do for children and families every day. I did see one last question come in. If you receive forgiveness, is the loan now income to be reported when filing taxes?
No, the PPP is not taxable if forgiveness is gained.
Great. All right, thanks so much, Greg. And
thank you
again.
Karen, thank you. And I want to thank everybody on the call. One of the great privileges that we've had is working with so many providers over the past couple of years. And so I just want to thank everybody on the call for everything that they're doing during really difficult and challenging times that have had an impact, I know, on their businesses and on their ability to do what they love to do, which is take care of kids.
Yes, and yet they've continued to do it in the most
yes,
difficult of circumstances. So thank you so much to all of the providers on the call. And we will be sharing a recording of today's call as well. So thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
Have a great night.
Bye-bye.